I must confess to, I think many of us who work in research ethics, work in research in general, in particular in the clinical trial world, have been frustrated for a long time that there have been many initiatives that have been undertaken in this country and elsewhere, but just focusing here on attempts to get us all to work together more effectively and more efficiently, and for whatever reason, it just hasn't come together. I think there are the winds of change blowing, though, and I think we have some opportunities that are presenting themselves for greater collaboration, harmonization, if you will. And what I'd like to do is go over some of them, talk a bit about the U.S. situation, give a little bit of history, talk about the drivers a little bit, and then if there's time at the end, maybe we could share some views of current initiatives and perhaps just, as I say, exchange views. Harmonization, why now? Past efforts, I'm going to go over those briefly, the impetus for change, some current initiatives, and then some prognostications, things that I think might actually roll out or be consequences of the activities at present. In the past, there's been a lot of discussion about how research should be governed, and that includes, but isn't limited to, research ethics boards. There was a report by the University of Ottawa Governance Center, the Chaitin Report, more than 10 years ago. The Law Society report, Michael McDonald's report, I think is from 2000. PRI has been involved with a research governance initiative, the College of Physicians and Surgeons Alberta and Alberta in general, the FRSQ with Article 21 and the designation of ethics boards in that province. Only certain ones can review certain kind of research. That is research involving minors and incompetent adults. Must be a ministerial designated board. The National Council on Ethics and Human Research has had a task force on accreditation with 2 reports, established a standards subcommittee some time ago. I sat on that, and nothing really came of it, I'm afraid. In any event, there's also been an expert committee report on human research participant protection in Canada that made recommendations, and that's probably 4 or 5 years now, and it advocated a model similar to the Canadian Council on Animal Care, and that too seems to have really not gone anywhere. So what's driving the change now? There has been a serious decline in new clinical trial applications in Canada, over 20%. We're losing ground as much as 12% per annum, and our global ranking has dropped from 2nd to 3rd or 4th. The clinical trials globally, according to clinicaltrials.gov, the registry that many of you, if not most of you, are familiar with, show various parts of the world, most interestingly Europe, with almost 29,000 clinical trials, more than half the number of the U.S., has grown quite substantially. When the EU directive on clinical trials was first promulgated 6 or 8 years ago, maybe more now, can't remember exactly, it resulted actually in quite a significant drop. And in fact, in Germany, the first year after the EU directive was implemented, there was over 400,000 people let go by the pharmaceutical industry following the EU directive. So there have been mechanisms that have put in place in different parts of the world that have harmed the cause of research, and yet they have been corrected in large measure. And so you see an uptick in countries like Germany and France, for example, that have overtaken Canada, where we were number 2. We've dropped substantially. If you look at China with about 8,500 clinical trials, they're about the same as us now. The FDA has established offices there, and so we cannot be complacent. And I think that has really struck home, and people people right through the entire pantheon of the clinical trial world and the research world are certainly recognizing that the time to take serious action is now. This is one pharmaceutical company's research projects and their distribution in different parts of the world. What is encouraging is that Canada has had a disproportionate share of clinical trials, disproportionate to our market size. That still continues. So I guess you could say that's the good news. We're still regarded as a good place to do research. But there is a publication called Clinical Trials Magnifier. It comes from Hong Kong. It's an extremely interesting publication. You can get it off the web, and there's a lot of interesting data that are compiled by people there. And in May, they had a description of the activity and actions that are going on in various parts of the world, and the numbers show very clearly that the industry is moving from North America. The U.S. had a decline of about 6%, 6.5% versus our 12%, so they're still huge, but they are also losing share. And the prognostication in this case is that the winner will be China, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. I would add Singapore, although it's a small country. They're really getting their act together. And with the FDA establishing offices in the Far East, for example, even in India, it gives you an idea of what we're up against. So what is the U.S. response? There is something called CITI, and more to that in a moment, that was created, and it's the Clinical Trial Transformative Initiative. They're talking about the need to understand why the clinical trial shift is going on, and the big concern is about the representation of the population in these clinical trials, and that there needs to be a reasonable number of patients to be included that actually represent the population in the country in which a drug will be registered. And I can give you a tangible example. We received a clinical trial a few months ago that was repeated in North America because the numbers of people that had been involved in the research did not represent the North American population. Therefore, the FDA was unwilling to move forward with registering the product. So these are important issues for the regulator, and I think for society at large. And so CITI, Clinical Trials Transformative Initiative, was put together between Duke University and the FDA's Office of Critical Path Programs to bring all interested stakeholders together to identify practices that, through broad adoption, to increase the quality and efficiency of clinical trials. And that certainly involves the Research Ethics Board, or as it's called in the United States, Institutional Review Board. And the city has expressly said that it is a problem, despite the fact that the U.S. government has actually endorsed the use of central IRBs in multi-center trials. So what else are they doing? Well, city is an important initiative. It brings together truly all the stakeholders, from industry to academic centers to independent IRBs to academic IRBs and so on, to try and identify issues that need to be resolved, understood and resolved. The regulatory regime that many have criticized, and rightly in my opinion, as being dysfunctional, really dysregulation of research. And the fact that there's two regimes, one for products that are regulated by the FDA and one for U.S. federally funded research. They have their own sets of regulations, and they can be quite different. Harmonization of these regs and guidance is essential. There's attempts to simplify the rules and regulations, new guidance on unanticipated problem reporting, for example, that conform more closely with what's being done in the rest of the world, with ICH, for example. There is an active promotion of central models of ethical review. To aid that, there's an increasing use of private sector central IRBs. I know of one, for example, that has an agreement with over 200 hospitals to review industry-sponsored trials. One board, one review, 200 hospitals. I think those of you who watch, for example, the warning letters have seen certainly quite a significant stepped-up regulatory activity, more inspections, looking at smaller and smaller things. And a growing understanding that accreditation is important. If it's done right, it can contribute to not only work being done correctly, but it also protects the institution from unfavorable regulatory agency inspections. Another thing that has recently come forward is this Department of Health and Human Services, ANPRM. You may or may not be familiar with it. It's Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. And there are a number of different things that they're attempting to do. This is reform of the U.S. regulatory regime. And essentially it's to revise existing risk-based framework so that review is appropriate to the level of risk. We have this already in the TCPS with the proportionality rule. And the way the regulatory regime in the U.S. has been structured, there is not really a recognition of the need to look at research projects in the context of the nature of the risk, and that the nature and in-depthness of the review ought to be proportionate to the level of risk. So that's coming forward. Interesting, this idea of a single review for all domestic sites of multi-site studies. No matter where they're done, whether they're done in an academic setting or whether they're done in private setting or a mix, one board, one review. Updating forms and processes. They're talking about the big concern that so many of us have, that the consent forms are becoming so complex that who can really understand them? Can we really expect the average citizen to cope with 20, 25, 30-page consent forms? So there's a real move to try and update requirements, streamline them, provide better guidance to ethics committees about what kind of language should be in the consent forms. I think a very important question is security and information protection standards. The U.S., I think, in some respects, has some of the weakest personal health information protections in the world. So they are looking to beef that up and also to relieve the ethics committees from the responsibility of looking at specifically these protections, because there is a feeling that IRBs, REBs are not really properly constituted necessarily to fully understand and deal with the privacy issues in much of the research. A systematic approach to data collection and analysis. Most of us who work in the regulated IRB, REB field have for so long been overwhelmed with the numbers of reports of adverse events, safety issues, and other problems that really ethics boards are not equipped to deal with. They cannot really make much sense of it. And yet there has been this regulatory imperative that you must send the information, boards must receive it, and then what do you do with it? Is there or is there not a legal responsibility to review all this information, even if you can't make sense of it? So that's been recognized, and they're really even talking about setting up a single repository through the web for sponsors and others to deposit this information, so that the life of ethics boards can be made simpler with this respect, and so you can really focus on the main work, which is ethical review of research, and not trying to deal with strange and unknown, uninterpretable reports. Point number 6 is very interesting because, as I mentioned, there's two different sets of rules in the U.S. One is, as I mentioned, for regulated products through the FDA, and one is for research that is federally funded. If something falls in between the cracks, there really is not a mechanism to deal with that. So number 6 to me really moves in the direction of what we have in Canada, where there is an MOU that must be signed by all institutions that receive granting council funding to apply the TCPS to all research. And to me, this is a move in that same direction, so that there can be a single unified requirement for ethical review, irrespective of funding source or irrespective of the regulatory agency that's responsible. Number 7, too, uniform guidance on federal regulations. There's different agencies. I think there's 11 in total that are involved, not just the FDA. For example, there's 11 different agencies. The EPA is an example. They all are allowed to interpret in their own way the quote-unquote common rule, which is 45 CFR 46 for those of you who live in that regulated world. I think this would be salutary. It's important. And I think the U.S. will certainly benefit from that, and it will help everybody, since so many of us receive federal funds from the United States to participate in research, and we have to be cognizant of this common rule and the U.S. regulatory requirements in that respect. However, there continues to be, has always been, and continues to be a real resistance to accept the idea of a central review. ASCO is the American Society of Clinical Oncology, and they postulated the following reasons for a resistance to central review. The assurance of review quality. How do I know that the guy next door, across the street, across the country, is really doing a quality review? I know what goes on in my institution, and I can trust that review, but I don't know about the other guy. Then there's the big question about sensitivity to local context. How can somebody 2,000 miles from where I sit in my institution really know what the local context is? I can't really trust them to understand. Question of liability, big issue. Then there's the control and accountability, which includes the education of researchers and the monitoring of the research. Again, difficult for a remote board to effect properly. And then there's the loss of resources. And I'll give you an example. I was at a meeting probably 2 years ago now in Ontario at Simcoe Hall at University of Toronto, and it was on this topic. And there's a person who runs the research ethics office at one of the teaching hospitals in the University of Toronto. And we were talking about OCREB and that model of central review. And this person said it was extremely difficult for her institution to give up doing ethics reviews because they would lose the funding that came with it, because there was a REB review fee. And without the REB review fee, particularly we're talking about industry-sponsored trials, it would be extraordinarily difficult to fund the Research Ethics Office properly. So this is an important question. There's also a question of competency, and we all know that to be good at any particular thing, you need to practice at it. And so your institution needs to be able to have a critical mass of research to review. I'm not sure that a move towards research harmonization would necessarily undermine that, particularly with teaching institutions that have an awful lot of activity within the intramural research and so on. But nonetheless, it is something to consider. Sorry about this. Got it. Okay, so what do we mean by harmonization? It doesn't always mean central review, and I think that's not always remembered. While central review is certainly the most efficient, there are other models that are quite possible. A collaborative review, there's a mutual recognition or a reciprocal review, and that could also mean an expedited review at the local level. Specialized research ethics boards, OCREB is a good example, or a regional national ethics board. The expert committee recommended a mixed model, no exclusion, and a new agency that would cover policy education and programs to ensure ethical research in humans with accreditation. As I mentioned, I think that recommendation is not in the cards, but I think accreditation certainly is, and I'll be spending some time on that. I found this phrase. Jerry Menikoff, who's the head of the Office for Human Research Protection, published a year ago in the New England Journal, that the idea, though, that an ethics review that's repeated many times in many places is actually a good thing. But he goes on to say, as you can read, this practice has been criticized for both wasting resources and leading to inappropriate delays in the conduct of research. I think most of us would say those delays are okay if they serve a useful purpose. So let's just look at that for a sec. Here in Canada, Paul Hébert from the University of Ottawa and Ray Saginaw, who is, as you may know, he is an ethicist, infectious disease consultant, and chair of the Ottawa Hospital Research Ethics Board, put it this way. After calculating the work involved, given the significant opportunity cost, one would hope to find clear evidence that such a labor-intensive process protects patients effectively, yet no such data exist. And that's the point. If theoretically multiple ethics reviews have added value, you ought to be able to demonstrate that somehow, and yet there is no such data. Michael McDonald is undertaking, as again some of you may know, with a working group, undertaking a project to try and identify ways and means to measure the effectiveness of research ethics boards. I think this is a really important activity, and I'm looking forward to the results of Michael's work. I'll go on to talk a bit now about some Canadian developments, the second edition of the TCPS, the standards question, and some provincial activities. So the Canadian response to the challenge. The TCPS2 is still, as you know, mainly focused on one institution, one REB, but it does recognize that alternative ethics review mechanisms from multi-centered studies can, in fact, be hammered out. It does clarify, compared to the TCPS1, the potential for collaborative, even outsourced ethics reviews by institutions. But it can be clear, and this was a point that was made at a clinical trial summit meeting just last week in Ottawa, that the TCPS can be clear and give more direction on ways and means that this can happen. Accreditation. This has been an issue that's been on Health Canada's radar for quite a long time, and a prime reason is because when the clinical trial regulations were first promulgated, as published in Canada Gazette 2 in 2001, June 20th, the Regulatory Impact Assessment Statement specifically noted that there is no accreditation system in Canada for Research Ethics Board. The situation is being reviewed by Health Canada, and then it names CIHR, NCEHR, and other stakeholders in the Canadian clinical research community. Now it's 10 years on, and it's still a problem. Why accreditation? It's foundational for any mutual recognition agreements, especially in the absence of Health Canada authority over research ethics operations. So if you had a scheme where we had a regulatory regime that was robust, that was well-defined, and you had a way to ensure that an ethics board that operated in one area had been measured somehow, and it could be through a regulatory inspection, there would be a certain level of understanding that you have at least some compliance, and that word kind of chokes in my throat because we're being compliance to death, but that's a discussion for another time perhaps. So you have no way of verifying that what's going on somewhere else is as good as worse than or better than what you're doing. So how can you trust somebody, as Reagan said? Trust, but verify. We need a verification scheme. And that includes our perception on the world stage. When regulatory agencies look at data that's been accumulated in various jurisdictions, one of the things they want to know is that there is a good verification system that ensures that the data is in fact valid. But if one way to go forward without having a regulatory regime like inspections, the regulatory agency inspections, how can you go forward? One way is through an accreditation process. And every hospital in Canada has to undergo an accreditation process. For example, providers of continuing education are typically accredited against standards. And you cannot, however, of course, have accreditation without a standard. One thing that I've come to learn over the years is that standard, like the word significant, actually has a technical meaning. And that's why you have something like the Canadian Standards Association or the Canadian General Standards Board, because there is a technical way to go about constructing a standard. The CGSB Committee to set standards for research ethics boards that review biomedical research, we're really talking about Health Canada regulated research. It was established 4 years ago. The work is ongoing. It was struck to set a voluntary standard for REBs that review biomedical research. And as I said before, REBs are outside the Health Canada Inspectorate mandate. It is a concern to our fellow ICH partners. A national standard of Canada is something entities could be held to. And I give the example of the CSA electrical standards, hockey helmets, and so on. I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but I have been given to understand that when Canada produced preclinical data, that is using animals, as part of submission packages to regulatory agencies in Europe, that data was not accepted because those regulatory agencies were not convinced that we had a regime that sufficiently protected animals in research. And that, as I understand it, is how the CCAC, one reason the CCAC came into effect, how it established its standards, and it has a robust accreditation program as well. So I think that was the model that was in the government's mind when it looked at the question of protecting human subjects. The CGSB standard was voted on recently. Work is still underway. And assuming that a standard is approved by the committee, it will need to be tested. The uptake has to be checked, and then there has to be a verification of adherence to the standard. Is it workable? Is it not workable? There will be a 3-year period to do that, after which the standard would be reassessed and adjusted if necessary. There are already some national ethics committees like the Canadian Blood Services, Stem Cell, PHAC, NRC, Health Canada. They primarily review in-house research. There's potential for more national research ethics boards, but there are jurisdictional and other issues. I'm not sure that everyone would welcome them anyway. Provincial initiatives. In Newfoundland, the legislation has been on the books for some time. It's finally been proclaimed. My understanding, and some of you may be more familiar with the reasons for the HREA to be created, researchers from the U.S. with U.S. university ethics approval flew into Newfoundland, took blood, diabetes genetics project, left the country without so much as a by your leave of anybody in Newfoundland. Any of the authorities. And when this came to light, of course, there was quite a bit of consternation and outrage. How could a research project like that takes genetic material from our people, go forward without anybody here really knowing about it or approving it? And so, based on that unfortunate example, steps were taken that's resulted in this legislation. There are, as I understand it, 3 REBs now, no private ones or for-profit ones. It was proclaimed on July 1st. It's in its early stages. I understand by Fern Brunger, whom you may know, some of you, that it appears to be working well at this point. In general, the Atlantic region, there's work underway to accept each other's reviews, all the Atlantic provinces, Capital Health. There are interpretations of the scope. Capital Health looks to conduct ethics reviews for all the researchers, private and public, in that region, which is the Halifax region. New Brunswick has regions as well. There's no intent to block Central or, for that matter, private but non-private ethics review. Conflict of interest is, of course, the big question. Nova Scotia privacy legislation is also an issue. The Patriot Act, as you know, essentially allows the American government to stick its nose in your private business, and both in BC and as I understand it, in the Atlantic regions, that has caused considerable concern. So that if there's personal health information that's collected as part of a research project and it's housed in the United States, it allows for the American government to go trolling through that information. Something that most of us in Canada would not really be comfortable with, and that's what I mean by the Patriot Act concerns. Now, I'm not sure, but I understand the actions there not necessarily to mean harmonization, formal harmonization with other regions, but there is great willingness to collaborate with others. The MCLS, the Quebec Ministry of Health, undertook a mechanism to try and streamline multi-center ethics reviews some years ago. Originally, it was 2 or more sites where there would be a lead institution with a coordinating investigator, and it would be responsible for the ethics review, but then it would go downstream to participating institutions who would have local responsibility. Essentially, they could say no if they wanted to, and the promised very quick turnaround times never materialized. There are now it's been changed from 2 to 4 sites. It does not apply, though, to private research sites, and as many of you may know, there's more and more research being done outside of academic or hospital institutions. The FRSQ, now renamed the QS, does have a central ethics board, and so you can get a harmonized ethics review for Article 21 research. Remember, that's children and incompetent adults. One central review through the FRSQ ethics board. There's no intention to designate private sector boards, so it would remain a public sector activity. They are interested in developments elsewhere, certainly looking to ways and means to work with counterparts around the country, but have stated that a national accreditation system is important if streamlining will be considered. Ontario Life Science Programs, the Ministry of Research and Innovation, I understand, has allocated about $11 million to this project. They have a model that's successful, OCREB, and they're looking to build on that. Have 8 hubs, OCREB in the medical schools. Probably they will permit private sector review as well, but at this point, no private-public partnership collaboration. And they've created the Ontario Public Health Agency for public health emergency research. That would be a central board. Other boards can opt in and accept the review. And of course, what we saw with SARS here in Southern Ontario certainly spoke volumes to the need to have a very robust, a very rapid review mechanism for research in a public health emergency. Manitoba and Saskatchewan, Their privacy legislation has a limitation on who can review research. There is pressure for the university to be the source of the research ethics review. They do not intend to harm their competitiveness, however, recognizing it's a global situation. We, happy to say, are designated by the Saskatchewan Ministry of Health to review research there. It's the only non-Saskatchewan-based REB to have that designation. There are active discussions underway with the University of Saskatchewan, University of Manitoba, University of Alberta, University of Calgary, and UBC for ways and means to collaborate closely with each other and to have some form of reciprocity or mutual recognition. Alberta, if you work in the private sector with industry-sponsored research, there are some who have used the term flyover province. And that's because if you look at the clinicaltrials.gov data, for example, it's clear that that Alberta is underrepresented when it comes to clinical trials. Much of the reason appears to be the research ethics mechanism that has been in place for over 10 years. However, the new legislation in 2010 changed certain things, and there has been a really strong initiative undertaken with this Alberta Health Research Ethics Reciprocity Agreement that was announced in February. And it seeks to harmonize ethics review processes in 3 phases: the implementation of the agreement, finding common approaches to inform consent guidelines and templates, which is often a major holdup of ethics approval, and a common ethics review application form. Also, the issue of technology is important. A common platform to work in the ethics space. BC Ethics Harmonization Initiative, it's been underway for a long time. It's led by the Michael Smith Foundation. It incorporates the public sector, UBC, BC Cancer Agency, and so on. The second stage is underway. There is an individual that's apparently a search underway as of now to help drive this process forward. I just wanted to take a second again on this privacy law question. In BC, the Privacy Act does require public institutions to retain personal information within Canada. So many of these global clinical trials are being run out of the States or elsewhere with big contract research organizations that have thousands of employees that are global themselves. I see this as a really difficult question of how to reconcile the 2 issues. One is the data collection and retention in Canada versus the data analysis and possibly storage and analysis in the United States. I'm not sure how that's going to be resolved, but my understanding is at present this privacy law provision is not being actively enforced. So in summary, there's lots of concern and a growing concern about the loss of clinical trials to the developing world, but it's also now we're losing to Western Europe and Eastern Europe as well. So what we're trying to do is reduce and remove obstacles to competitiveness. A multi-center ethics review is considered an important impediment to competitiveness because it's fragmented. CIHR is taking the lead. It's partnered with RxD and ICAO. And there appears to be an endorsement of REB accreditation as critical to trust building. There's also a recognition that no one-size-fits-all approach will really work in this country. Unlike most of the EU countries, for example, one review for the country, that's it. But I do think that individual provinces are still taking silo approaches. where each province, recognizing a problem, working with its own jurisdiction, has put millions of dollars in trying to figure out how to do it right within the province. And it just keeps coming up against obstacles. And how far these initiatives will go to actually solve the problems, it's hard to say. But there's a lot of experimentation going on right around the country. CIHR, RxD, and ACAO, as I say, this new initiative that's been undertaken, there was a clinical trial summit last week, really seeks to break down these barriers and bring the stakeholders together and move forward in an effective way. And the UK is being looked at as a model. They've had some of the same problems we have had, difficulties with researchers getting together, difficulties with ethics review. In January of last year, a paper was published on a way forward to simplify the regulatory regime. The harmonization of ethics review there is not an issue because it's all NHS and it's designated ethics boards, which, by the way, have been drastically reduced in number. Some years ago, there were over 300 ethics committees in the United Kingdom, and that number is now down to well under 100. And so where you have a system of accreditation and oversight and specialization, there does seem to be a significant reduction in the number of ethics boards that actually are involved in reviewing clinical trials. I believe the same was true in the Netherlands, where they went from over 80 to something like 14 or 15. I'm not exactly sure of the numbers, though. What implications that has for us, I don't know yet. We'll find out. So we need a standard. It's critical to trust building, and without it, how do we break down these borders? I think a standard will, in fact, lead to a Made in Canada accreditation. The outsourcing phenomenon in the U.S., one of the reasons it's grown is because of the regulatory actions that the FDA has taken. And given the focus that most institutions have on delivery of care and their intramural research, the heavy burden of compliance with sometimes very small but critical requirements imposed by a regulatory regime, it's not something that the research ethics office or that hospital really wants to assume. It's very expensive. And so the outsourcing phenomenon has grown there to boards that are regularly inspected by the FDA and are accredited. What will happen here remains to be seen. Certainly the use of technology is growing. I think it's a really important thing, but what platforms, at what cost, not everybody is going to be able to do this. But there are a small number of platforms, and there is a coalescing around 2 or 3 of them. One thing I do want to mention, though, when we've looked at this in detail, what we've seen is all of the platforms, with one notable exception that appear to be used in Canada, do not conform with best practices for computer validation. And if we're talking about U.S. regulated studies, which many of these are, 21 CFR Part 11 is the relevant U.S. regulation. It has extremely tough, very strict compliance requirements. And that, I think, is going to become an issue that needs to be dealt with. And at this point, it really isn't getting the attention that it needs. So, in the future, clearly progress is being made. I think it's going to take time before substantial national change comes about. Provinces are still creating silos, but there is experimentation with mechanisms for mutual recognition. I see that, I'm part of it, and I'm encouraged by it. The private sector does have a role to play. What role that eventually may or may not be remains to be determined. There is huge pressure to reform the system, but that means, of course, the law of unintended consequences is likely to kick in. And I would say that the Quebec multicentric experiment with two centers is an example. It created more problems than it solved. So as we reform the system, we have to be really careful to try and think through what possible consequences, good and bad, might come of any reform actions. Oops. So hopeful signs, serious attention to finding solutions to. I think it's fair to say we have a balkanized system. Federally, Canada is working to find ways to improve our competitiveness. That includes Industry Canada, it includes international trade. There's activities going on around the world to try and promote Canada as a good place to do research. The Clinical Trials Office and the Inspectorate, though, there are some things that happen that sometimes make you wonder, because some decisions are being made that are not in harmony with decisions or even inspections in other jurisdictions, and they don't seem to have necessarily as good a basis as one might hope. The cost of doing business here, unfortunately, we are now the highest cost jurisdiction for clinical trials. However, their most recent data seems to show that the cost of doing research in the developing world is rising rapidly too. So the gap is not as big as it once was. I understand it from being twice as expensive to do research in North America. Now the differential is only around 15%. So it's still significant, but it's not as great. We continue to be a preferred destination, and we're finally aggressively acting to preserve and enhance our position. So I think there is certainly room for hope. That is, of course, against the backdrop of loss of 20% in clinical trial applications. So we do need to turn things around, but I'm hopeful that we'll be able at least to stabilize, if not to recover, our position. So thank you for paying attention, for being there, and I'm certainly more than happy to take any questions.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jack. So everybody should be able to see now the text box on their screen where they can type their questions. And it'll just take a couple of minutes for folks to start typing them in. So Jack, you should be able to see the questions online now. If you can just read them out as well, because the other attendees can't see them.
Okay. This is the question is, thanks for bearing. This is the first I've heard of the CIHR, RX&D, ACAHO Harmonization Initiative. I do find it encouraging, promising. However, I would argue that the UK model is currently inappropriate to the Canadian, and then I cannot see any more of the question. So if I just interpret this as the UK model is currently inappropriate and leave it at that, that may not be.
If you click on it, Jack, it'll open the rest of the box.
Thank you. Okay, so UK model is currently inappropriate to the Canadian context as it assumes a shared health record between hospitals. I'd further argue that a common health record for patient safety reasons is a necessary prerequisite to implementing any UK-like REB review model in Canada, bracketing out all issues relating to inconsistency, lack of standardization, lack of accreditation of Canadian REBs. Would be interested to hear your thoughts. Just as a bit of background, we have adopted the UK system for research ethics applications. It's been modified to our requirements, both our corporate requirements and North American regulatory requirements. But that means we're in regular touch with the providers of the UK, the NRES system. And so I think there's a little bit of current and in-depth knowledge of the realities on the ground. I would agree with you, Josh. I think there's some very serious issues that differentiate Canada from the U.S. Constitutionally, for one. There's one national health system, and as you're told by the government, in quotation marks. We have a very different constitutional model. So on that basis alone, I think it's very dangerous to say the UK is exactly what we need. I think there are things we can take out of it. I think I'm very encouraged by the leadership in that country to recognize that a process of dysregulation that has taken hold in the United States and has extended to a certain degree in Canada, driven by the U.S., is stifling. It stifles research, stifles researchers, it stifles freedom. And there is a serious move to try and uncomplicate things in the UK and presumably, and we've seen that also to a certain degree in the EU. E-health records, huge, no question about that. But there are other reasons why I think that the model that the UK represents is not ideal. Maybe the Australian model could be a little better. I think there's a lot to be said about the American model too. Again, you learn from their mistakes, you take what's best. Just a word about the CIHR, RX&D, and ICAO initiatives. The ethics harmonization project has been actually underway by CIHR for some time. There is a committee that met December 10th, I think, last year, of stakeholders. A small committee, perhaps a dozen, if I remember correctly. Ray Sagener is on that committee. I'm on that committee. Some of the provinces are on that committee. Industry Canada is there. Health Canada is there, and so on. And that is to tackle the specific question of harmonization. What I only learned a couple of months ago is that there is a real concerted and coordinated action now with RX&D, major funder, ICAO, hugely important, and CIHR to find ways and means to very quickly bring Canada's competitiveness forward, and that the ethics harmonization bit is seen as a crucial part of that. Where it'll end up, how fast it'll move, I don't really know. But I think it's the first time I've seen in over a dozen years now a group like this coming together in a determined way. So we'll see. And hopefully it'll achieve its objectives. Next question. Wondering where you feel that education fits into an accreditation system based on standards. Should education be provided by the accrediting body? Do you have any other thoughts about education, the need to build in financial support for education at a local jurisdictional level as well as a national level? I don't think anybody can ever overstate the importance of education. The question really is who's responsible. Many of us, and I'm one of them, feels that the REB should not carry the primary burden for education. It's a form of mission creep. It's an institutional responsibility, maybe now a national responsibility. So I can't really go beyond that except to say that I think there should be multiple sources of good information from preferably accredited providers once there is a standard, but even beyond that. I mean, we know the TCPS has a central role in research. We know that we work in the clinical trial world in a regulated environment. There's an awful lot of people providing, for example, GCP training. I'm not sure how much of it is really any good. And so you're talking about a compliance mixed model, compliance on the one hand, ethical standards on another. I don't know where we're going to go with this, but just in general, yeah, education is critical. I think there needs to be a fund available from as many sources as possible. If it's CIHR or PRE, wonderful. and so that there will be some uniformity. And another thing is the quality check. The quality of education has to be there, and I think we right now are facing a great variability in quality of information and also quality of instruction. Instructional methods need to be mixed and appropriate to the audience. So again, I don't have any real specific answer for you, Patty, but I hope that's at least it's sharing my thoughts. Next question. Harmonization of REB review in Canada has been described as an efficiency. How is efficiency being defined? The majority of the problem that has been implied relates to time and resources that it takes to undergo multiple REB reviews. The primary focus of REB review and REB operation should be on ensuring protection of human subjects, and therefore other harmonization approaches, e.g. consistent standardized review by all REBs, the more appropriate means of achieving this. That's an interesting perspective. I don't know how many of you are recipients or have access to the Health Law Review, but Volume 19, Number 3, 2011, in other words, the current issue, Michael McDonald's the guest editor, it speaks very broadly, the entire issue, to the questions that you've just raised. One of the critical issues that I think that we face collectively is what metrics should we collect? Is it just turnaround time? Is it a percentage of studies that get approved without conditions? Is it numbers of days of delay? I mean, what should it be? Those are clearly not measures of effectiveness, but they are measures of efficiency. So if we talk about efficiency in those terms, metrics around time, I think that's really what we're talking about. And I'll give you an example. In the EU, the clock is 60 days maximum. That's it. That's what is permitted. And most REBs in the EU work to a 60-day time frame. It's law. You can't take longer than that. Now, there's ways and means, depending on the project, where that could be mitigated. Newfoundland, the legislation there says a 30-day turnaround time. So if you're talking about efficiency, yes, we're talking about time. Once you're talking about qualitative versus quantitative measures, I've always felt that the notion of quality systems, as it's been applied to clinical research, research in general, and research ethics boards in particular, is all about making sure that every widget that comes off an assembly line is exactly the same as the one before it and the one after it. I don't think that's the best approach, and yet it's an essential one. So the whole question of what should we measure, that is a serious one, and it's one that presently is being looked at, again, in a very serious way by Michael McDonald. I don't know. You know, I gave a talk actually at CARIB in the spring, and this was really the focus. It was all about, you know, what I did is I listed off the IRB self-evaluation checklist that the FDA produces, and it's got a whole bunch of really neat things that you need to have in order to show that you are in compliance. And you go through all the different regulatory references, and at the end of the day, you come back to what the FDA says, which is demonstration of compliance with these regulations is, and I'm paraphrasing, de facto proof of human subject protection. But is compliance equivalent to, is compliance with regulation equivalent to effectiveness? I don't think it is. That's a recognized issue. And there's lots of work being undertaken in the United States by people like Holly Taylor and others, Christine Grady at NIH, for example, to try and come to grips with the question that you are posing. At the end of the day, though, if we're talking about competitiveness in the clinical trial world and ways in which to reduce the barrier of multi-center, multiple fragmented ethics reviews in this country, I think it comes back to a standard that will help to both answer the compliance question and at the same time ensure that appropriate, proper ethics reviews are really being done and not rubber stamps just for the purpose of making things fast.
Jack, I'm thinking that we're just gone a bit over time, so maybe if you can select one more question from the list that you have there, and then we'll close after that.
Okay. Well, there's a question about funding. It's a good question. Who should fund research ethics? I think it's institutional. I think we have a role in the private sector. We should also be involved. Advocate for a centralized education compliance model. The answer is yes, with conditions. Central review boards such as ours mainly review private office research, yes. But we also review research for hospitals that either don't have an ethics board or wish to avail themselves of the efficiencies. Then the last one, because I think people want to know how close we are to having the CGSB draft approved. I'm not at liberty to really talk about it. That's one of the conditions of membership. I can only say that there was a vote. The vote passed by a narrow margin, and there is discussion underway now by the chair, Glenn Greiner, from the University of Alberta, to reconcile opposing views. And my personal hope is that he will be successful, and that within the next, perhaps by the end of this calendar year, we could have an approved standard. So I think that's about it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time to...
I will just offer anybody who wants to ask me any of these questions, there's some more coming in, or corollaries to the first ones.
Right.
Just send me an email, jcorman@irbservices.com, and I'd be happy to continue the dialogue if anybody wants.